Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's webinar on critical care nutrition. My name is Dr. Pritesh Patel and I am the medical and scientific head at Nestle Health Science. Today, the discussion will go around on managing GI intolerances in ICU and its implications. For the discussion, we have an eminent speaker, Dr. Sharmili Sinha. Dr. Sharmili Sinha is the head and senior consultant critical care medicine at Apollo Hospitals, Bhubaneswar, with over 10 years of clinical expertise. She is also a chairperson at ISCCM Bhubaneswar from 2019 to 2021 period. She is also a national executive member for the East Zone in National Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine, Mumbai. She has passed her MD anesthesia from PGI Chandigarh in 2004 and worked in reputed centers like TMH Mumbai, Hinduja Hospital, and Grant Medical College Mumbai. Dr. Sinha also completed advanced training in intensive care from Sydney, Australia in 2011. She holds a European diploma in critical care in 2011 from London. She is also a member of multiple academic societies like SCCM USA, ESICM Europe, Society of Neurocritical Care from USA. Dr. Sinha has delivered more than 40 guest lectures at local, zonal, and national levels and presented in Brussels Meet at and SCCM Florida Meet at international levels. She conceptualized and convened straight conferences in critical care in Odisha in 2018. She is also one of the most important leader of the critical care team involved in the first ever deceased organ donation in Odisha. She has at her credit about 15 publications in index journals and book chapters. Her main area of clinical interest lies in neurocritical care, trauma, nutrition, and infection control. So welcome, Dr. Sharmili Sinha. So before we start the session, I would like to inform everyone that there will also be an interactive polling sessions in between the presentations. So please click on the poll icon on the right hand side of your window screen to select the answers. So now, without further ado, I request Dr. Sinha to enlighten us with the on the managing GI intolerance and its implications for this topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Pritesh, for your kind words. And a very good evening to all the attendees, my friends and colleagues from all over the country who are present here. I hope all of you are doing well and keeping safe at your respective places. These are very difficult times for all of us across the globe. And this is the time where nutrition has been very much emphasized for its own importances. Never before in my last 20 years of clinical practice, I had witnessed or heard so much emphasis on practice of nutrition, on its importance in general medicine and critical care medicine. Hence, I believe we have chosen a very topic of importance and quite relevance for the current times when we decide to talk about managing GI intolerances in ICU and its implications. So, the learning objective of this session will be, friends, to know the prevalence, causes, and consequences of malnutrition in ICU and patients, to understand the economic impact of malnutrition in ICU patients, and to identify arising gaps and chart out solutions to cover those nutritional issues in critically ill patients. So, my friends, just we rehearse the basics of ICU care. This is a very familiar acronym in critical care, which is practiced called FAST HUG-BITS. F stands for fluids, A for analgesia, S for sedation, T for thromboprophylaxis, H for head-up positions for all ventilated patients or patients who are requiring respiratory support, U for ulcer prophylaxis, and G stands for gut or nutrition, and B stands for bowel care. So these two components are been very important in managing ICU patients. And rest are for infection control, de-escalation of drugs, and sugar control. So let's look at the prevalence of malnutrition in critically ill patients across the globe and in Indian scenarios. If you see at the globe, the rate of malnutrition in ICU ranges something between 20 to 50%. 20 to 50% is something is very, very high. But the fact that we maybe most of the times underestimate or this problem is underrecognized that patients have who are in ICU generally have multi-organ issues, and many times they are critically ill. They are on organ supports like vasopressors to maintain their blood pressure, or either on ventilator for the respiratory support, or on dialysis for the kidney support. So, because all these organ issues appear so vivid and critical, that nutrition is most of the times underlooked or overlooked. Coming to India, about 40%, that is at least two-fifths of the ICU patients are malnourished, and prevalence varies from mild to moderate to severe malnutrition. You can see mild to moderate malnutrition are higher sides up to 45 to 50%, and severe malnourishment is up to 9%. I would emphasize on the moderate category, moderate and severe malnutrition, because for patients who are staying in ICU for more than 5 days or more, they are the ones who are the worst sufferers due to malnutrition, because this has definitely an impact on all aspects of organ functions, as we'll see in the subsequent slides. So, what are the causes of malnutrition in ICUs? This can be easily guessed, I believe, but let's again go through the chart because these are very important on our day to day practice. As you see, there are abnormal nutrient losses and there are resistance to anabolic hormones. What are anabolic hormones? Anabolic hormones are the ones which are responsible for growth of the tissues. Because in a human body, there is constant catabolism, that is, there is wearing and wearing of the organ tissues, and there is also anabolism. That means there is building of the tissues, mostly the proteins of all organ systems. So, in a patient who is intensive care unit, there is resistance to anabolic hormones. Hence, the building hormones are not able to work well. At the same time, catabolism is overtaking or predominating. Hence, there is waxing and waning of the body. There is more of deteriorations. So, there is as well abnormal nutrient losses because of the wounds and different tubes, pipes is there, and there are renal replacement therapy. If there is diarrhea, emesis, or there has been a surgery due to third space loss, there is a lot of losses from different systems or different tubes or pores. There is decreased substrate utilizations. There is decreased utilization of glucose and amino acids. Glucose is the basic substrate for calorie generation or ATP generation in our body. But under the circumstances when the patient is sick, there is hemodynamic compromise, blood supply, oxygen delivery to the tissues are compromised, and as a result, the cellular level utilization of glucose is also compromised. And as I mentioned, there is increased catabolic hormones and cytokines. This is something again has been more emphasized and is now in very much in limelight. Cytokine storm. If you talk about the current SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 pandemic, the cytokine storm has actually created a very difficult situation, challenging situation for all the intensivists across the globe. Because when there is a surge of cytokine, we call it cytokine storm. So they come in such huge numbers that it is completely overwhelms the body. And this is the situation, this is one of the most important causes of death in patients affected with COVID-19 infection who are admitted in ICU. We'll talk about it, about the special nutrition requirements for COVID-19 cases subsequently. And there is also increased nutrient needs because there is a catabolic state, and we to surmount the effect of catabolism and to maintain the body and to subsequently up to that, we have to have increased nutrients. There is decreased level of blood anabolic hormones. There is interaction with different drugs. There is decreased nutrient intake prior to and during hospitalizations. This is because the blood circulation is compromised for a patient who is on vasopressors, on ventilator, or multi-organ support. And also the level of cytokines and the inflammatory mediators also interfere with the function of the gut epithelium and the endothelial cells. So this is a good summary of the causes of malnutrition in intensive care unit. So malnutrition or nutrition deprivation is very much common or expected in a patient who is critically ill. Hence, we have to give special attention to this group of patients. So GI tract is the largest area exposed to external environment. If you measure it anatomically, 300 meters squares of functional area. So friends, when you talk about third space loss for patients who have had, say, abdominal surgeries or pancreatitis or any injury, blunt trauma to the abdomen, most of the times during our rounds and teachings, We talk about third space loss. What is the third space loss? If you just close your eyes and imagine, then what is that? It is just an abdomen and there are some few loops are there. Why you're talking about third space loss? But it is just not that area that we visually see. If you dissect the entire intestinal surface, it is up to 300 meters square of functional area. So it's a large surface, and this surface, when it is exposed, not functioning, there is a lot of space, third space loss, where we refer to this surface area. So this is important for digestion and absorption, for immune function. Why immune function? Why? How is gut responsible for immunity? Many times you see about these probiotics, GERDs, and this advertisement of this immune enhancing products in the media. This is because the gut associated lymphoid tissue. I repeat, it is gut associated lymphoid tissue. It contains the two-thirds of the active immune cells and 80% of all antibody producing cells. So now this is something very, very substantial. Many times when a patient is healthy, we are, we just function, no issues are there, we do not talk about it. But this is the current time where everybody is focused on enhancing their immunity, either by taking drugs or by proper diet. This is something is very much in focus. And I would say that this associated lymphoid tissue is the highest, almost the highest reservoir of active immune cells and antibody producing cells are present here. So it is very important that our gut remains functioning intact and we keep utilizing it to enhance and augment our immunity. It is a very good protective barrier as well because of the structural component of the mucosa. It protects the body against the pathogenic microorganisms and other potentially harmful substances such as food allergens. Now, how does the gut protect us from these harmful microorganisms? I think you would have heard about overusage of this PPIs, the antacids or the proton pump inhibitors. This acidity in our stomach, the acidity in the stomach is actually protective. Why the gastric juice is acidic? It has a purpose. It has a purpose that it kills the bacteria which we are engulf otherwise during a sputum or from inadvertently would have inhaled those bacteria, and if they end up getting into the GI tract, this acidity of the gastric juice kills it. Similarly, the pH of the gastric GI juices are also protective. They kill the unnecessary harmful bacteria and protect us. Hence, this has to be maintained properly. So all these functions are actually also very much dependent on our food habits. The kind of food that we take and that are suitable for the gut are complementary to each other. So the kind of food and the gut function are complementary to each other, and this is in relevance with the kind of food products that we choose in our lives and in critically ill patients that again we will be discussing. So compromised gut can have severe adverse sequences. We just discussed that. It can lead to growth failure, loss of muscle strength and body fat, and show slow wound healing, because if there is less anabolism and more catabolism, you will not get, the tissues will not grow. So the damaged tissues will not heal, right? And there is increased morbidity and mortality as a consequence. Impaired immune functions we discussed, and increased length. If all this will sum up to increased hospital stay, increased ICU stay, increased cost, more susceptibility to infections. About SIDS, malnutrition, its associated consequences. This is something that we discussed about infections and stress ulcers, nutrition absorptions, compromised renal functions. And this is something important, I would say, about at physical level, reduced respiratory muscle and cardiac function. Many times we just talk about when you see a patient in ICU who has been there for say more than 1 week or 2 weeks and is hooked to the ventilator, there is slow weaning from the ventilator. We talk about that. It is probably critical illness, polyneuromyopathy, and patient is wasted. When there is respiratory muscles are wasted, obviously the patient is not able to generate the required amount of inspiratory pressures for lung expansion, and hence he or she is requiring more support from the ventilator. So this is reduced respiratory muscle and cardiac function is one of the very important consequence of malnutrition, which has a bearing on the outcome, and hence the patient also ends up having increased number of ventilator days. There is atrophy of visceral organs as well, increased muscle loss, loss of body weight, decreased physical fitness, and depression. Psychological level, it leads to fatigue and apathy. Suppose a patient who is on ventilator, and once we start weaning from the ventilator, we give them spontaneous trial. We call it PSV, pressure support trials. We put them from control to the pressure support. After, maybe depending on their capability, after 1 to 2 hours, they get fatigue, and they again the level of respiratory support has to go up. So when a patient is awake and is not able to get off the ventilator after 1 to 2 hours of pressure support trial, they get fatigued, and this leads to depression that many times we have seen in a clinical practice. And also this leads to loss of appetite and delays recovery. So summing up, increases length of hospital stay, increased rate of complications, mortality, and healthcare cost. This is an interesting trial. You see that patients in the critical care unit setting receive only 50% of their target calories from one day to the next. So suppose you have a nutrition plan for a patient in ICU, whatever you have planned, for variety of reasons, in 1 or 2 days, they maximum get 50 to 60% of their desired goal. And we get to know only next day after 24 hours when you are doing the morning rounds or afternoon rounds. During the last 24 hours, somehow or other, 50%, most of them end up getting only 50% of their target calories. And 70%, 74% of mechanical ventilated patients fail to get or attain 80% of their energy targets. We'll come to those calculation of targets and the calories for them. So what are the problems associated with failure to attain the nutrition goals? It results in, again, the same issues like increase in ventilator days, increased complications, and length of stay. So everything is increased. So this is a very short summary of the challenges that we encounter in delivery of nutrition in ICU. So it very much starts with the concept of nutrition. Because when a patient is critically ill in the ICU, as I told you about on multi-organ dysfunction or multi-organ failure, our focus is on the hemodynamics, that the blood pressure is low, heart rate is fast or less, urine output not coming, patient is hypoxic, patient needs to be attached to the ventilator, which kind of antibiotics should I give, any other newer drugs that we should be giving. So focus is on this major organ functions which are visible and which reflect directly on the and which directly reflect on the report. Suppose you're getting a renal function report. You see urea creatinine high. You're thinking about how to correct the urea creatinine, how the urine output will increase. You see blood pressure is decreasing. It is 70 by 50. You need to increase the vasopressor. Similarly, hypoxia is there. I need to change the ventilator. So in all this, struggle or exercise of stabilizing the patient, nutrition is overlooked many a times, especially in the first 3 to 5 days. Next is deciding the route. Many times it takes time to decide which way is the best. Suppose the patient has got sepsis, any abdominal surgery, or a patient has got liver diseases, patient has got coagulopathy. So we are not able to place an nasogastric tube or deciding the alternate modes of nutrition. Again, the type of feed also, which is to be given for patients who are having mainly fluid restrictions in the kidney or the cardiac patients, that is a dilemma many a times. Total calculation of total calories and proteins that needs to be given is again varies from place to place. And if you talk to the nurses and the junior residents or the registrars who are actually most of the time spending by the bedside with the patients, if you ask them, their concept regarding the calculation of calories and of protein are not satisfactory. And very few centers, I would believe, are there where actually there is a regular mention of the target protein and calories is mentioned in the documents, and it is very less often it is also checked during rounds. This is one of the major issues or challenges that is hampers the delivery of adequate ICU nutrition. And also, adequacy of vitamins, minerals, and trace elements, the doses are not assessed. There is frequent interruptions of feed for different procedures, investigations. Feeds are withheld due to large aspirates. And this is again a big challenge. If you speak to the dietitians and the nurses and the residents and registrars, feed withholding due to gastric aspirates is a very common and frequent phenomenon. And again, they have variety of or large spectrum of ideas regarding when to hold feeds or when not to hold feeds. And diarrheas in ICU are also increasingly becoming a more troublesome phenomenon, because most of these diarrheas are mostly associated with antibiotics due to uses of more higher number of antibiotics, higher spectrum of antibiotics, due to osmolality of feed sometimes, or due to dysfunction of the GI system or a distension. An assessment of ongoing nutrition is actually which should be happening daily along with review of other drugs and medications, doesn't happen very frequently. Immunonutrition is another aspect which I think again also needs more discussions and more perspective in the critically ill patients. So, what should be our feeding goals in patients in ICU, and what are the factors for non-attainment of these feeding goals? According to ASPEN recommendations, energy requirements is up to 25 to 30 kilocalorie per kg per day.
Ah,
So, for a 70 kg patient,
plant.
it could be around 2,100 or around 1,800 to 2,000 calories per day. And protein requirement is up to 1.5 to 1.2 kgs of actual body weight per day, right? So I'd emphasize on these 2 points, the calorie requirement and the protein requirement, because this is again, as I mentioned, that the simple basic idea that how much protein is required and how much calories is required, we have to start from there. It is the nurse at the bedside and the dietitian and the doctor who is staying by the bedside, the registrar or the resident, they need to be very clearly acquainted with the energy and the protein requirement. So if I average it, this is around 25 to 30 calories per day per kg, and protein requirement is up to 2 kgs per kilogram for actual body weight. Now, what are the factors for non-attainment of these goals? I think I also mentioned it, it's rehearsal, but it's worth rehearsing that. It is held due to treatments and different procedures. Hemodynamic instability for a patient whose BP is low, who is a noradrenaline or vasopressin, they tend not to absorb feeds because there is splanchnic vasoconstriction. Splanchnic vessels are the vessels which supply the intestines, and when there is low blood pressure, if you are giving a vasopressor, actually these patients, the splanchnic vessels tend to vasoconstrict. Thereby, the guts become stasis. There is hypostasis of the gut because the gut is not getting its required blood supply. So the gut becomes hypostatic. Hence, the feed does not move and does not get absorbed, and we get higher aspirates. And delay in feed procurement. This is, I think, a practical issue as well in the units, because most of the times the nurses or the dietitians, they raise the feed requirement in the system or maybe telephonically sometimes, but not all the time the feed is brought or served to the patients on time. It is from kitchen is at a distance, ICU is at a distance. So by the time suppose it is feed at 12 o'clock, the feed reaches at 1 o'clock, and 2 o'clock is handover time. So many times the feed just remains and handover is done, and maybe 2 or 2:30, the 12 o'clock feed is now being given at 2 o'clock. So many times actually the feed is not being given at the exact prescribed time that it's supposed to go. And of course, there are GI disorders like bleeding and diarrhea. So, friends, I think we'll just take time to have a quick look at a clinical scenario. It's a practical scenario, and this patient was there in our ICU. So, I've just framed a question to know like how we are going up so far. So, let me read the question for you. It's a 24-year-old polytrauma patient who is on ventilator and is scheduled for femur fracture surgery at 12 o'clock, 12 noon. He is on enteral feed. Is that right? In the pre-anesthetic checkup, the anesthetist said, let's get an ultrasound abdomen to do if there is any visceral organ injury or not. Clinically, there is no signs, but they wanted to be double sure and they wanted to do an ultrasound abdomen to see if there is any visceral organ injury or not. So the question is, for ultrasound abdomen, how long will you fast him? 6 hours, B is 2 hours, C, no need of fasting. I think most of the attendants or all of the attendants can see the question, right? Okay, so I think all of you, it's a small question. So I would say Dr. Pritesh, and we can go for polling now. We are going for
Yes.
polling. Yeah.
So there is a
Pritesh, you can.
small, yes, there is a poll icon at, at the right hand side of the corner. You may start, click on it and start polling. It will show you the results.
Okay. I think polling is going on. We
It
have
is
20
going on.
seconds or 25.
So I think the polling is done.
Polling closed.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's closed.
Yeah. I see a good response in terms of number of responses. So let me read it. So 26% have gone for option A, 6 hours. 30% have gone for 2 hours for option B, that is 2 hours, and 43%, that is the highest number of response, is for no need of fasting. So this was for ultrasound abdomen, right? That the patient we needed asked for fasting hours. I think I would disagree with the highest number of responses. The correct answer shall be 6 hours. It is not 2 hours or not that it doesn't need fasting. The correct answer is 6 hours. The reason being because when we are doing an ultrasound abdomen, all the organs that we intend to look at are the liver, gallbladder, spleen, and we have the intestines, of course, right? And we have the urinary bladder and the kidneys and pancreas. So minimum 6 hours of fasting for ultrasound abdomen, where we intend to look at all these 6 or 7 organs is required. Because once we take the feed, if we are in a fasting state, suppose we are not fasting, what will happen? Suppose you have given the feed at morning 8 o'clock and you're taking the patient for 9 o'clock if you're taking the patient for ultrasound abdomen. So that means that will be no need of fasting. The gallbladder will be contracted. Depending on the type of food you have given, your gallbladder will be contracted. There will be feed in the stomach, right? And the intestines may not be completely, it will be partially filled. We may not be able to know the exact status of all the organs, especially the gallbladder one, right? So for ultrasound abdomen, minimum 4 to 6 hours of fasting is required. Because 4 is not mentioned here, that's why I mentioned 6 hours. No need of fasting is definitely not the correct response, right? And 2 hours is also not adequate enough because we don't know, like depending on the gastric capacity, the food may not have completely passed, the gallbladder may be contracted. So for ultrasound abdomen, the desirable will be minimum 4 to 6 hours because 4 hours is not mentioned here. So 6 hours will be the correct response. If anyone has any other queries, you can type in and Dr. Pritesh can read it for me. Dr.
Yes,
Pritesh,
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
yeah, if anybody disagree or you have any queries, you can yeah, we
Yes,
can
for
discuss that.
now. Yes, we can discuss. We can take the questions in the end. So I'm keeping a note of them. For this
Okay, you are
particular
not,
there are no questions for me.
okay, fine.
Yeah.
We proceed then. I proceed.
Yes.
But
Yes.
for my dear friends and colleagues, if you have questions regarding this answer also, please chat it to Dr. Pritesh and we can take it up at the end, right? So I proceed to the next slide. What is actually question? Same patient who is on ventilator scheduled for femur fracture surgery at 12 noon. He is on enteral feed. How long will you fast him for GA? Because he is on ventilator, so he'll be given a general anesthesia. So how long will you fast him for GA, general anesthesia? So Dr. Pritesh, you can go for polling. Same
Yes, ma'am.
patient for surgery now. This patient
Yes,
is
ma'am.
scheduled for surgery under general anesthesia. How much fasting?
So the process will be the similar. You have to go to the Paul icon, and then we can start. So we can start the poll. Yes, I can. We can end the poll.
Right. So it was very close actually. It's difficult.
Yes.
6 hours, very narrow margin between answers, but still we'll take it up because this is the most common scenario in ICUs we see, and one that's why I deliberately kept this question because many times you see this patient is posted for surgery. So when the operation surgery list comes out, and actually when the patient goes to theater and the fasting instructions, everything vary, and at the end, जो करना है करो उसको fasting रखो surgery करा दो. So that is what it ends up like, right? We are
Yeah.
not very sure about even 8 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours. Patient ends up having fasting for maybe 18 to 20 hours or maybe 24 hours sometimes. So this is this question I brought up intentionally. Now the highest response has been for 8 hours, option
8
B.
hours.
8 hours, option B, and the second most highest response is for option A, 6 hours, and C is the least number of response, 2 hours. So according to the audiences, if I take the audience poll, the answer is 8 hours, B, option B. But I disagree on that. I disagree. I'll cite my reasons on that. Because this patient is on ventilator and he is on enteral feed. Enteral feed means there is either a nasogastric tube or a orogastric tube is already there, right? So, and because if the patient has been given a orogastric or nasogastric feed, and the patient is supposed immediately after 1 hour or 2 hours is taken for the surgery. OT is a call again, you send the patient, right? By the time patient reaches the OT, it will be at least immediately after also, it will be not less than 1 hour or half an hour or 1 hour. By the time the patient is taken to the table and prepared for anesthesia, it will be around 1 to 2 hours, something like that. The best part about these cases is because there is already a nasogastric tube, you can aspirate the feed, right? If you're worried that administration of general anesthesia can cause gastric distension and patient might vomit, right? Then also there is no worry because airway is secured. Patient
Yes.
is on ventilator, right? Airway is secured. What are you worried of? That why do we keep patients fasting? Because we fear that due to general anesthesia, the patient might vomit and might aspirate. But this patient is already on ventilator, so his airway is already secured. So even if there is vomiting, it's not going to go into his respiratory tract, right? That is point number one. And point number two is because there is a nasogastric tube in place, you just aspirate it, right? Is it's mechanical? So this patient, minimum hour, maximum 2 hours, even if you have kept him fasting, that is good enough. 6 hours, 8 hours is not required for a patient who is on ventilator. Similarly, we follow for these patients. Suppose a patient who is on ventilator, I think friends, you know that many times we do tracheostomy for them, right? For tracheostomy is also a surgery, it's a airway surgery. Even for these patients also, we maximally fast them for 2 hours. We give the feed at 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock, 2:30 we start the surgery. Because by then, most likely, the kind of feed we give would have gone down. And even if you are worried, you just aspirate the nasogastric tube. So you need not fast these patients for a long time. More than 2 hours is not required for giving general anesthesia when airway is already secured, right? I think that's a good point that we can take up in this right.
Yes.
So this untreated malnourished state causes increase in healthcare cost. There are various values are here, right? So it is economic or financial implications are also huge. This economic cost of hospital malnutrition data from Europe, if you see, it's in euros. The annual cost for 20 million annual patients, the annual cost due to malnourishment state is 120 billion. So this is probably 10 to 20 times of Indian GDP. I don't know. I mean, so high, right? But indirectly or directly, definitely it is related to nutrition because the health, the status is definitely related to nutrition, either malnourished or overnourished, which is called obesity and the lifestyle diseases. Similarly, it is data from Asia as well. Combined data from WHO and China Health and Nutrition Survey. It was about 6.1 millions for daily adjusted quality life years. But you would not like something combination of WHO and China at this point, so I'll not emphasize on that. But definitely, it increases the healthcare cost and narrows or delays functional recovery. And it's one of the WHO studies again, which shows that oral nutrition supplementations reduce hospitalization cost by around 21%. That is again debatable though, but few of these have actually done well in the last few years. Oral nutrition supplements. It's short called as ONS. This is about again the cost effectiveness of oral nutrition supplements. So now coming to different types of enteric formulas, right? So most of the us actually what we use in our ICU are either kitchen blend formulas or formula feeds. Kitchen blend where you have a kitchen, you are preparing with all these components of vegetables or milk or other fluids is prepared in the kitchen and delivered to the ICUs. But nowadays, I think the best way to give enteral nutrition is formula feed because this is easier, less cumbersome, and you can more predictable. The way you deliver the calories and the protein, it is more predictable. So what all formulas do we have with us? This is the standard or the polymeric formula. I think many companies have their different formulas. This is standard of polymeric formulas. It contains intact proteins, complex carbohydrates, and triglycerides, low chain triglycerides. And it requires a normal digestive tract or absorption process to be intact. It mimics micronutrients as food found in the whole food. And it's available with different energy densities and protein contents. So these are standard or polymeric formulas. What about the elemental formulas? Elemental formulas are the ones which contain only few amino acids. They are generally low in fat and especially the low chain triglycerides and requires minimal digestive function, causes less stimulation of the pancreatic secretions. So this is the normal one, standard formulas, elemental one, the simplest one. Followed by we have the semi-elemental formula. I think this is the one which has actually revolutionized enteral feeding in critically ill patients in last 5 to 6 years. So let's focus on that. This semi-elemental formula contains proteins that are hydrolyzed partly into oligopeptides of various lengths. So they are not amino acids. Few amino acids are already there and they are in chains of oligopeptides of varying lengths, dipeptides and tripeptides. They contain MCTs, that is medium chain triglycerides, and they're absorbed more efficiently than individual amino acids or whole proteins. So absorption is actually much better than standard or the elemental formula, right? And it promotes jejunal absorption of water and electrolytes as well. So this is a formula which has actually revolutionized the enteral feeding in critically ill patients in last 5 to 6 years, and I have also experienced with good results in this with this formula. Now coming to the specialized formula, which is designed to meet specific nutrients needs, like for patients who are having liver impairment or kidney impairment, we call this renal feed or hepatic feeds or high protein diets like that. What is the comparison between polymeric formulas versus elemental or semi-elemental formulas? So, as I said, the semi-elemental formulas are better absorbed and they are less allergenic because it's not whole intact protein, it is broken down into oligopeptides or dipeptides or tripeptides. So, allergenicity is less. It is also better tolerated in patients with malabsorptive states because if a big protein has to be broken down into smaller fragments and then absorbed through the epithelial cells, it obviously needs more work to be done. And for a gut which is not completely healthy or which is just recovering, it is easier to absorb those proteins which are already partially hydrolyzed. So these are smaller chains instead of a large intact large chain. It's a small amino acid or dipeptide or tripeptide. Hence, it is absorbed easily through the epithelial cells through those transporters. And it also causes less exocrine pancreatic stimulation because obviously a whole protein need not be digested here. That's why it does not require the pancreatic stimulation in the or larger quantity of pancreatic juices, which are otherwise required for patients with intact gut who are taking the whole intact protein. And this particular phenomenon or property is more useful for patients with pancreatitis who are improving and you have just started the enteral feeds. Hence, it's achieving faster achievements of nutritional goals. In contrast, in the polymeric formulas, there is increased fat content or increased proteins. For those intact proteins and fat to be hydrolyzed, you need more of the gastric juices or the pancreatic juices to be excreted. Hence, pancreas will be stimulus. So, a pancreas which is inflamed, and if it is again stimulated, obviously recovery is not going to be faster, and it's not, as a result, does not get absorbed, and there is more pain. And also, excess synthetic oleate may be responsible for the low remission rates in Crohn's disease. The high low chain triglycerides, linoleic acid may also attenuate the effect of enteral nutrition in inducing Crohn's disease. So for this, another group is called Crohn's disease patients who are chronic patients. They have small ulcers distributed throughout the small intestine. For those also, the intact proteins or these LCTs, low chain triglycerides, are not good. So they also do better with the MCTs, that is medium chain triglycerides and small chain peptides, which are found in the semi-elemental feed or formulas. I think we have already discussed this. What is the summary is that suppose there is a 65-year-old male who is admitted in ICU after a vehicle accident. After surgery, he is on ventilator. He is weighing around 75 kgs, right? And he has a BMI of 27. He is intubated and ready to receive enteral nutrition. As per ASPEN recommendation, energy estimated, as we said, is around 1800 to 2200 for this patient, and protein requirement is up to 150 gram per day, 90 to 150 gram per day, right? Now our target is to give more than 80% of the energy and proteins, which will be around 1500 calories, and protein is around 72 grams per day. But to meet this 80% of the energy and protein targets with standard isocaloric formula, the patient should receive around 1500 ml of the prepared feed per day. But many times it is not achieved. As we said, I've seen that up to 48% of the patients are having moderate malnutrition, and up to 10% of patients are having severe malnutrition in ICUs with polymeric formulations because of the variety of reasons that it does not get absorbed. So, what are the challenges in nutrition delivery for a patient who is on ventilator? This is the same patient, suppose we talked about. Similar kind of patients, mostly in ICU or on ventilator. What are the challenges in nutrition delivery? Most of these patients are on some kind of sedation, like opioids or benzodiazepines. Because the patient is on ventilator, we have to keep them quiet and sedated so that they tolerate the ventilator, and other therapies are going on. Again, most of them will having some degree of mild to moderate hemodynamic instability. They'll be on vasopressors like noradrenaline or vasopressin. What these drugs do, that they cause splanchnic vasoconstriction that I've already discussed, and they interfere with the gut supply, blood supply. So the intestines become slow. They do not absorb the feeds. Similarly, the sedations also make the gut slow. So food is not easily absorbed. And if there is mild abdominal injuries of any kind, which has not been noticed in these patients, maybe sometimes there is just slight intestinal lacerations or mesenteric laceration. This is not found easily on the ultrasound or the CT scans. But if the patient is stable clinically, we do not do more investigations. But those kind of concealed mild abdominal injuries also interfere with food absorption or food intolerance in the initial days. And of course, not to forget about the electrolyte abnormalities like hypokalemia. Potassium is the most common electrolyte which is implicated in abdominal distension and followed by magnesium. So time to time, the desirable limit is up to more than 4. If it is less than 4 and there is abdominal distension not tolerated, we tend to supplement it. And valid concept of nasogastric aspirates. This is a very practical point because many times you see come for the rounds, and when you are looking at the records, you see that 1 or 2 feet have been withheld, or sometimes 3 or 4 feet also have been withheld. This is due to high nasogastric aspirate if you speak to the bedside nurses. So, what is the practices that the latest aspirin guidelines have recommended that we can accept up to high level of nasogastric aspirate. It says up to 500 ml of nasogastric aspirates can be accepted. So, meaning that, right, suppose 300 ml of NG aspirate is coming, you can still aspirate and give the next feed. You did not throw that aspirate, right? So, if the aspirate is less than 30% or less than 50% of the previous feed, the next feed can be given. And for patients who are having abdominal injuries or abdominal pathologies like pancreatitis, if the aspirate is less than 500 ml, you can start feeding these patients. Thereby meaning, suppose a patient is on bolus method. Suppose you are giving 200 ml second hour. So if your aspirate before the next feed, if the aspirate is around 80 ml, like 200 ml, 50% is 100 ml. But now at after 2 hours, the aspirate is 80 ml, so which is less than 100 ml. So this patient you can give the next feed, right? And for a patient, or suppose who had got an abdominal injury and improving, who had an abdominal surgery or pancreatitis, if the aspirate is less than 500 ml, you can contemplate to start low doses of enteral feed for these patients. Procedures and imaging we have discussed during these questions. And if there is abdominal distension, you have to work on the cause. What is the cause of abdominal distension? And latest addition is the diarrheas. Nowadays, the diarrheas in ICUs are becoming more common, mostly due to prolonged use of antibiotics and also sometimes due to varying composition of the enteral feeds. If the protein content is high, sometimes it is more concentrated. Patients do not tolerate the feed and tend to have diarrheas. Diarrhea doesn't mean we completely hold the feed. We can instead give a break, maybe 4 hours, 6 hours, and review the cause. And if you feel it is due to the diet formula itself, you can dilute. You can cut down the level of the protein, make it less concentrated, but continue the enteral feed because this is the best thing to do for patient who is in ICU. It maintains the gut integrity and patient is not completely deprived of nutrition because in those 1 to 2 days, none of the calories are being delivered either through the enteral route or the parenteral route. So that is cumulative negative calorie deprivation for these patients. So these semi-elemental diets, they have got whey-based hydrolyzed protein formulas. And this is one aspect to be highlighted because whey is less allergenic. Patients who have got chronic disease, short bowel syndromes, or hyperimmune guts, they have actually allergies to different this lactose-based diets. So this semi-elemental feed or the partially hydrolyzed feeds are whey-based using whey-based proteins, which is very less allergenic. So the beneficial in nutritionally high-risk patients like the Crohn's disease, short bowel syndromes, pancreatitis, we have discussed this, and various other patients and old genetic population as well. So it has resulted in better weight gain, better growth, reduction of systemic inflammatory response and nutrition assimilations, better mortality rates and lower healthcare costs. So what is the role of peptides as fast-time nutrients for faster recovery in ICU? I think we have discussed this about this requirement of energy and protein as per recommendations and micronutrients as based on the individual needs. This aspect again has been highlighted in the context of COVID-19 epidemic now. So just a quick look at the benefits of early enteral nutrition in ICU patients that I was just discussing. that it helps in maintaining the structural and functional integrity of the gut. The second point that we saw when we looked at the anatomy of the gut is that the gut associated lymphoid tissue, GALT, we call it GALT in short, it contains 80% of the immune cells and antibody producing cells of the body. So it is very important to maintain the structural and the functional integrity of the gut. What happens if you're not feeding the gut for more than 3 days? This gut integrity starts falling. The gut epithelium or mucosa starts tearing apart, and thereby the bacteria from the gut starts entering our body. It's called gut translocation of the bacteria, and they cause sepsis. At the same time, this gall tissue, the lymphoid tissue, also does not function well. Sorry. And also, it helps in modulating the stress and the systemic immune response and attenuate the disease severity. Decreases the ICU length of stay, and other favorable outcomes are there. If you delay, what happens? As a consequence, the opposite of the good outcomes, better outcomes like longer ICU stay, there is high risk of pneumonia. Where how does this high risk of pneumonia happen? I'll just tell you in short. Again, the same mechanisms. If the gut integrity is not maintained, there is breach of gut integrity. There occurs gut translocation of the bacteria, and because the GI tract and the food pipe and the respiratory airways are just parallel to each other, many times there occurs GE refluxes, gastroesophageal refluxes, and this comes to the oropharynx area, and from oropharynx it goes to the larynx and the respiratory tract. So if there is increased load of the bacteria in the GI system, this very well reflect into the respiratory tract as well. So that is why increased use of these proton pump inhibitors like pantoprazole, which in the long term can facilitate overgrowth of bacteria. And number two, if you are not feeding the patient by the gut for a long time, both these factors can increase the load of bacteria in the GI tract, and this reflects in the oropharynx, goes to larynx and the respiratory tract, causing high incidence of hospital acquired pneumonia, or if the patient is on ventilator, it can cause ventilator associated pneumonia. I think that is clear. And the aspirin recommendation is like for patients who are in ICU, as soon as they're hemodynamically stable, they should be started on enteral feed within 24 hours. The rationale and the reason and the rationale remains the same. So it has a positive impact on patient outcomes like reduction in the pneumonia, intra-abdominal abscess, significant reduction of all these parameters, neurologic outcome, and cost effectiveness. So this is almost a summary slide for the advantages of peptide-based formulas. I request the attendants to take a very close look at this. It improves absorption, it improves nitrogen retention in utilizations, that is an anabolic action. It helps in building of the muscles, and there is reduction of bacterial translocation, hence reduces the chances of nosocomial infections, maintains gut integrity, improves protein synthesis, immune support, diarrheal episodes are less, and liver function is also better, and overall improved clinical outcome. Because they are absorbed faster and adequately, the nutrition goals are achieved faster. This has been also found in many studies, like peptide-based formulas cause less diarrhea and fewer interruptions in tube feeding seen in pediatric burn patients, also in surgical patients. Improved GI tolerance and GI absorption with peptide-based formulas. Significant significant decrease in pain scores in pancreatitis, decreased gastric emptying, and significant reduction in vomiting because the absorption is faster in pancreatitis patients, right? Improved growth and development patterns and decreased mortality with peptide-based formulas. I think this is another study which has the similar results. And this is actually been studied on patients with Crohn's disease. Similar outcomes, that better absorptions, better growth parameters, decreased mortality, less hospital stay, and less healthcare costs. One of the Aspen recommendation has been to avoid soluble and insoluble fibers in patients with who are at high risk for bowel ischemia or severe dysmotility. For these reasons, patients who are having persistent diarrhea or they have malabsorption issues should be avoiding fibers. And these are the patients where these peptide-based formulas are again recommended because absorption is faster, there is less residue thereby. So this is a protocol. The formula which is available, one of the formulas available is called Peptamen 1.5. Or there are other company formulas also. That means like this when the recommended fluid is added to this either water or milk, this powders are prepared. It can be to a concentration of 1.5 calories per ml, or you can dilute it to even 1 ml per calories, like any other standard polymeric formula. Calculate your calories, calculate your volume limitations, and accordingly, you can decide to give. It can be given in an intermittent bolus method, like 100 ml secondarily or 200 ml secondarily, or it can be given as a continuous method if you have provision for that. But as I mentioned, that you have to uh, really judicious about considering your nasogastric aspirate, because if the nasogastric aspirate is less than 50% of the previous feed, you can continue with the enteral feed. If it is more than 50% of the previous feed, then you hold one feed. After another 2 hours, you check what is the aspirate and then accordingly proceed. I think we have discussed this. And this can be very much individualized. Essentially, we need to calculate our calories and proteins and the volume restrictions. Suppose a patient who has got heart failure or kidney failure, they have been prescribed fluid restrictions, suppose 1.5 liters a day. So also there are some injections for that or the other medicines that the patient is getting. So for the nutrition part, you can keep 1 liter or 1.2 liters. So with that limited volume, if you want to deliver the calories and the proteins, you have to accordingly prepare a calorie concentrated feed. You can make it a 2 cal feed. 2 cal feed means 2 calories per ml, or you can make it 1.5 ml, 1.5 calories per ml like that, or isocaloric, that is 1 calorie per 1 ml. So according to the patient, it can be customized. But the rate of hourly feed when you're giving Peptamen better not exceed 150 ml per hour. That means 200 or 300, not more than 300 ml secondarily, right? Maximum that we have given in a clinical practice at a time volume is should not exceed 200 ml per in second hour. That means not 100 ml in second hour. And here the recommendation is definitely not exceed 150 ml per hour. Right? This is a study from 18 ICUs from US and Canada where they have looked at around 1100 patients mechanical ventilated. And enhanced protein energy provision via the enteral feeding route is safe and results in modest but statistically significant increase in protein and calorie intake for patients in ICU with low baseline nutritional adequacy. When they were giving a semi-elemental or the peptide-based diet compared to polymeric feeds, they had these positive outcomes. So the indications again, once again to summarize in Crohn's disease, indications for peptide-based formulas are in Crohn's disease, short bowel syndrome, acute and chronic pancreatitis are one of the very important indications for critical care unit and hospitalized patients. Patients with cystic fibrosis and who have got cerebral vascular accidents or immunodeficiency patients and geriatric patients, because their gut absorption is capacity are to some extent to some are compromised. So they are the ones who will benefit most from peptide based formulas because they are absorbed easily and have got less side effects. So a quick note on the nutrition and SARS-CoV-2. Thankfully, in this pandemic, most of the patients, up to 85% of the patients who have been affected with this viral illness are having mild symptoms. So they are like normal ones, and they can just need to be again just taking normal diets with adequate hydrations and vitamin C, vitamin D, and all other immuno-enhancing diets they have been following, so that they can continue to do. But for patients who are hospitalized, which includes mostly moderate to severely ill, critically ill patients, they are in a state of hyperinflammation. That by meaning thereby, like in these cases, this virus has typically has been shown to generate higher level of cytokines in the body. And the disease manifestation is a balance of how the body is responding to this cytokines stops. When the body is falling weak and the virus cytokines are taking the upper hand, it is resulting in something called CRS, cytokine release stop, where the cytokines are taking the upper hand. That is creating a hyperinflammatory state. But patients who have got good immunity, intact immunity, they are being able to fight this cytokines. Thereby, they are remaining in the moderate to severely ill. Even if they are severely ill, they are coming out of the illness. Right. And in India, the mortality has been maximum 3%, I believe, to 2.6% last that I saw. So this is actually a game of the immune system entirely. The immune system is intact, even if there is release of the cytokines, it is countering it appropriately, and after a certain plateau, the cytokines are vanishing and the immunity is taking over, patient is being coming back to normalcy. But in during those hyperinflammatory state, when the body is there, which is lingering sometimes from 6 to 10 days up to 14 days, that is a time where we have to try to boost the immunity by various medication or means that is available so far. And how would you know a patient is in that hyperinflammatory state or the hypercatabolic state for a patient who has got corona infection? You can measure the blood levels of interleukin 6, CRP levels, D dimer levels, and ferritin levels. These are the patients, moderate to severely ill patients who are in ICU. Actually, along with other medications, we have to very much emphasize on the nutrition, because there is definitely loss of appetite. There is very severe loss of appetite, smell and taste as well. They cannot eat by themselves, so we have to devise different ways and means to feed these patients. So, what about this normal? About the recommended diets, calories and proteins? I would say calories and protein recommendation are the same as any other seriously ill patient in ICU, like 25 to 30 calories per kg per day, and protein is up to 1.5 to 2 gram per kg per standard body weight. Right. What about this micronutrients? Definitely, there has been emphasis on these micronutrients like zinc, chromium, manganese, and those stress elements. Vitamin C as an antioxidant, vitamin D is also as an antioxidant, thiamine as an immune enhancer is in general also being followed in sepsis. So all these immunonutrients, I would say now vitamin C and D is also coming under that, have been very much emphasized and they have been practiced. You can always question the level of evidence for usage of these micronutrients and these immune enhancing supplements. But in a pandemic, it is too short a time that we can generate evidence for based on expert opinions and then from experiences. This continue. They have already found a place in the treatment of SARS-CoV-2 and will continue to use it for some time till it is completely disproved. So in these patients who are moderate to severely ill patients, they are having definitely more probability of GI intolerance, right? Because again, the hyperinflammation is going to affect the GI mucosa as well. The patient is not feeling well. There is some degree of hepatic impairment as well. So patient may be anorexic, not eating. So what we recommend is like along with if the patient is conscious enough in a state to eat, they can eat whatever they want to eat. But you can supplement these diets with small doses of or 3 doses of this peptide-based formulas. We can give them like we take this Horlicks or Bonvita, all those kind of energy drinks are available in the market. For this group of patients, we can supplement their normal diet, which they're taking by mouth, with some peptide-based diets, maybe 2 to 3 times a day. So it will supplement along with their normal diet. They're taking rice, dal, or the curry or vegetables, whatever they are taking. Along with that, as an energy enhancing or energy additive diet, we can promote this peptide-based formulas. This is, I think, the last or the third question for audiences who are still so far still listening to this presentation. It's a 45-year-old male with acute necrotizing pancreatitis was admitted outside for 3 days. It was also a real patient. He was admitted under MENAR I unit only with prior abdominal pain and vomiting. He had acute kidney injury. He has a femoral dialysis line and a central line. By day 7, I emphasize day 7. He has already spent 3 days outside. Now in the ICU, it is day 7. So by total 10 days of the disease, right? He has initially high nasogastric aspirates at 900 ml, it reduced to 750, then 400, then today it is 300 ml, right? He has got high grade fever. And day 10 of the illness. And there is no vasopressors. BP is stable, creatinine is normal. So, what will be your nutrition plan? A. Enteral, B. Parenteral, C. Enteral plus partial parenteral nutrition. I think we can go for the poll.
Yes, the poll has been
I'm
initialized.
sure.
It has been
I'm
started.
sure everyone will give one answer. It will be 100% one answer. It is day 10. Aspirate is less, right? And
Yes, we have ended the poll.
yeah, we done?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The highest scorer or the percentage is for enteral nutrition. So everyone agrees that we should feed enterally. Enteral is the best. Gut should win. I agree with all of you. But the second, can I see the response? Second one was the. What is the poll result? Where is the poll result? Second response was, I think, second highest was 35% for option C, enteral plus
Yes.
parental nutrition.
Hmm.
Right, that was the second response. That's the second highest response. I would say both are correct actually. Right. Somebody wants to feed enterally, that is also perfectly acceptable. Nobody can deny that. This is day 10, and you can start enteral diet. But again, in these cases, when we start diet, this will be obviously low volume diet will start. So if somebody put forth an argument that I would like to start enteral plus I'll give partial parenteral nutrition, because I'm not expecting that the full goal can be achieved soon, either in the 24 hours or in the 48 hours. And also it remains to be seen like how the patient's abdomen behaves. So we can give enteral and also I can start partial parenteral nutrition. That will also be correct. So both options A and C are correct, right? Because enteral also, even if you're starting, it will be a low dose, and we have to see for a patient who has got an acute necrotizing pancreatitis, obviously the target will take longer to be achieved. So there is no harm in trying also a partial parenteral nutrition in the meantime. So both A and C are correct. I'm happy that all my fellow colleagues are attentive and are with me. So we proceed to the next slide. I think I have one more question and that's the last one.
Hmm.
Yes. Now I think it's almost you're close to your target. So, if enteral, which one will you choose? A. Polymeric formula, B. Peptide based, C. Elemental diet. Let me see if I get 100% response of one option.
So we have
The poll
started.
can start.
Yeah, we have
Yeah,
started.
poll started. Die, no, no. I think you're going to the towards the target. Good.
Yes, ma'am. Poll has ended.
Okay, good. Very good. I think this is a champion answer. It is option B, that is peptide based is 80%. So
Yes.
massive score for peptide based diet. And I think that is the right choice. Because for a patient who has got acute necrotizing pancreatitis, that is the worst pancreatitis that one can have. And day 10, and he has got organ issues like kidney was injured, is improved. So definitely it's a challenging situation. So by no means we should try to avoid stimulating the pancreas. So for that reason, if you are choosing to feed enterally, best to give a peptide-based diet because it is partially digested or hydrolyzed proteins. These are dipeptides, tripeptides, oligopeptides, so it will be easily absorbed through the mucosa, and it doesn't need much of the pancreatic juices to be secreted. So pancreatic stimulation will not happen, which will not further worsen your pancreatic inflammatory status. They're easier to absorb, and also they have got MCTs, that is medium chain triglycerides, which are also better nutritional value and absorptive values, and anti-inflammatory role as well. Correct. And it has got good calorie as well. So all your purposes are solved. Right. We are giving for those who believe that polymeric formula, definitely when suppose we are 10 years back, when we did not have option of these partially digested proteins or these peptides, of course I would come go with you that you try with polymeric formulas. But today, if you ask me in 2020, I would definitely go for a peptide based diet in these patients. And for my friends who have voted for elemental diet, I think that is also we need to change. It is quite it is. I honor your opinion, but again, in today's time, when we have an option of peptide-based diet, I'll go with that because as we saw in the previous slides, elemental diet have got only amino acids, right? So protein intake will be less, and again, they have got very low level of calories and LCTs, low chain triglycerides. So total calorie values, total protein values are very less, right? So this will not serve the purpose. So the best option is the peptide-based diet because they are small chain amino acids, good calories, and good triglycerides. Everything is there in one go. So you can and absorptive values are less. I mean, very good. So complication rates are less. So peptide-based diets are certainly a first choice in these cases. So pancreatitis is one of the classic examples where the gut is injured and it has a long recovery process. At the same time, we have to start the interval feed as early as possible. So peptide-based diets with their all safety profile, all safety boxes ticked are the best choice. I reiterate. We'll see which other conditions in our clinical practice that I have used these diets. Oh, this is another diet, another question we have. So we'll not let you rest. You have to again work on this. 65-year-old male with large intraventricular bleed. Yes, this is a real-time question. Actually, it's all from my own clinical experience. I pulled these scenarios. Large intraventricular bleed, that is a brain hemorrhage with raised intracranial pressure. GCS, that is the Glasgow Coma Scale, is low. That means the patient is comatose, in short. And he is on the ventilator, slow weaning from the ventilator. Right? So it's a sick patient. On morning rounds, the nurse says that he is not absorbing feeds. This is a common complaint from the nurses. You would see that patient is not absorbing feeds. Amylase, and the resident has ordered amylase lipase and electrolyte levels, which are also normal, right? Uh, Reducing the doses of the feed has been tried, and prokinetics also have been tried, but did not work. Abdomen on examination is not distended. Abdomen is soft, not distended. So what to do? We have two options. The resident asked me, Madam, should I give total parental nutrition? That is option A. Or option B is try peptide based diet for few days and then change to normal formula after 3 to 5 days. So we have two options, A and B. Polling starts.
Yes.
Okay. I
Yes.
think everyone is clever, wise now. So everyone will go for peptide based diet for few days and change to normal formula after 3 to 5 days. Parental nutritions are a good supplement or replacement, but in appropriate cases. This case has primarily a brain pathology, and the gut behavior that patient is not absorbing feed is most likely due to a raised intracranial pressure, brain, the increased pressure inside the brain, which is having a impact on the stomach and the intestine. Neurogenic cause. That is where patient is gone into gut hypostasis, feed is not being absorbed. So the best in these cases is gut function is normal, but due to stasis, food is just there before you are giving the normal feed, the polymeric formula. So these are the cases where if you try peptide-based diet in the low dose and gradually escalate, bring it to the normal target level, they absorb, feed the well. Because the absorption time is less, it is completely absorbed and it does not need more of the pancreatic or the gastric juices, but participation in the absorption process is also low. So your target of nutrition target is achieved, abdomen is not distended, you are not challenging the body further. While the intracranial pressure takes its time to resolve, this kind of this kind of diet helps to take care of nutrition. And this is an actually increasingly become one of the common indications for using this peptide based diet, because nowadays if you see the number of neuro patients belonging to neurosciences in neurocritical care unit, either from the brain strokes or from the road traffic accidents, are on the rise. In the last 3 months probably it is very less. There's one reason we can thank Corona, but we're not happy about it. But it's one good thing that we see a serious decline in the rates of road traffic accidents and other lifestyle diseases as well. But these are the cases. Otherwise, if you study a unit, in our unit, 45% of cases are belonging to neurosciences. And very often I see this issue. The patient will be doing well, suddenly one day not absorbing feeds and 2 days has not been fed. So these kind of patients, when you change the formula, give a low dose and upscale the dosing, after certain time, it is absorbed. And after 3 to 5 days or 7 days, you can change to a normal polymeric formula. So in my experience, I summarize that it has been well accepted or given good results in patients with sepsis and septic shock with hemodynamic instability on vasopressors. Mild abdominal injury patients were not initially tolerating polymeric feeds, acute pancreatitis, post GI surgeries when started on enteral feeds. Neurocritical care patients with raised intracranial pressures, that includes the stroke patients and the road traffic accident patients. Post ICU diarrheas, when better to start with peptide based diets, because when you think it is due to antibiotics or due to high osmolality of the polymeric feeds, you can give a break. Start with this peptide based diets, which does not irritate the gut, and gradually achieve your goals. Neurogenic GI dysmotility, like in patients with Guillain-Barré syndrome and cervical spine cases, when other obstructive causes are excluded, because these category of patients also have a neurogenic cause for GI dysmotility. And again, the gut finds it difficult to absorb the polymeric fix. So these are the one group of patients again where you can try this peptide-based diets. And primary GI diseases like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis also have their own reasons to the structure and the disease process, that this partially hydrolyzed protein or peptide-based diets are better tolerated. Summarizing to managing for regarding managing of the GI intolerance, we have to exclude any organic injury and obstructive causes. Electrolytes, we have to ensure it is normal, treat the constipation. Peptide-based formula in low doses and gradual escalation of it to achieve the targets is one of the best way to manage the GI intolerance while targeting to achieve the calorie and the protein goals. And if you have an infection, obviously treat it. Key messages are like malnutrition ranges between 20 to 50%, and patients in critical care unit only receive 50% of the total calories the one day to the next day, which can lead to severe complications. And semi-elemental formulas are better absorbed, less allergenic, well tolerated, and thus help in achieving our nutrition goals faster. Compared to other formulas, they're associated with better growth and weight gains, lower mortality rates, and result in lower healthcare costs. These peptide-based formulas are also ensure faster recovery of bowel functions, leading to a shorter hospital stay, improved GI GI tolerance, and improved nutrition absorption. And hence, starting an enteral feed with semi-elemental formula is preferable, as this would be easily digested, absorbed, and be tolerated by a greater number of patients, including mechanically ventilated patients. So this is a patient actually who was with us for almost 6 months in our ICU after a bee sting. He was stung by around 350 bees on his body. He was a 13-year-old boy, and he was with us after a massive ARDS. It's the worst kind of ARDS, that is acute respiratory distress syndrome, that I had ever seen in my life. He stayed with us for almost 6 hours. He had renal failure from which he recovered. He was on a ventilator for almost 6 months. You can see in this picture while he is on the ventilator, there is a nasogastric tube which is giving enteral feed, and also we are feeding him orally. We are giving him because he was a very cute child. He was asking for idli and noodles also while he was on the ventilator, and also I decided to start some supplementary energy drinks with this peptide formulas, because off and on through the tube he was having high aspirate. So to supplement the diet, somehow he was doing well through his mouth, and we were supplementing also with the intermittent energy drinks like this formula fits twice or thrice a day, right? And after 6 months he was shifted to ward, and then he was discharged. This is a picture at the time of discharge with me. He had actually gained weight at the time of discharge. It is in contrast to our common experience where patients lose weight. He has actually gained weight. Right? So feed early and feed well with the correct formula in critically ill patients. Extended ABC of ICU, they have extended it to, you can extend it to D for diet. And remember, friends, like I think all of us across the globe, in every household now there is emphasis on the right kind of food, because starting from ginger to garlic and haldi and whatnot. So in this is the time, it's never been like that where there have been so much emphasis on the right kind of feed across the mankind. So also we should have adopt the right approach to feed our critically ill patients with the appropriate kind of diet in the scenarios. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sina, for that fantastic explanation. I guess the attendees must have also enjoyed listening to you, and we are getting a lot of messages and feedbacks regarding that. It was, the topic was very well explained. So thank you so much for that wonderful explanation. So we do have a lot of questions, but I don't know how if we'll be able to address all of them due to the paucity of time. So,
Yeah,
ma'am,
I would like to see.
yes. So, ma'am, there is one question from Mr. Praveen Kumar Pade. What he's saying is that from your experience, is there any positive correlation between a high SOFA or Apache 2 score and concurrence of GI dysfunction?
Oh, yes, definitely. When we say it is high Apache or SOFA score, that means SOFA score is sequential organ dysfunction score, functional assessment score. So that means high SOFA score means the patient's number of organ systems are more affected. So he may be having hemodynamic instability, low blood pressure. He may be on ventilator, that is kidney failure, GI failure, like that. So the sicker the patient is, the worse is the GI performance. Because as I said, in a shock patient, there is splanchnic vasoconstriction. Gut is not receiving its own blood supply because the preferential blood goes to the lungs and the heart and the brain. So gut and the skin are steal phenomenon. Blood is stolen from gut and the skin and is supplied to kidneys, heart, lungs, and brain. So GI definitely suffers. So there is more probability of GI intolerance in these patients. And that is the reason that we consider the right kind of formula in these patients when they're slightly better off.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. So, ma'am, there is another question by Ms. Madhurima. How long a peptide-based formula should be continued, especially for the chronic patients?
Correct. So there could be two type of scenarios in these cases. Patients who have got Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, which are structural disease, and they're chronic disease. They live with these disease conditions at home also. So for those patients, their diet has to be modified. So whatever they're taking orally, along with that, Because most of the times, whatever they are taking orally, it is not adequate in terms of calories and proteins. Most of them are short bowel syndromes or irritable bowel syndromes. If you see, assess those patients on OPD basis, they are malnourished, right? So I would say for these patients, if they are at home, let them take whatever they are taking orally, according to dietitian advice. But their feed should be ideally supplemented with this kind of peptide-based diet at least 2 to 3 times. As we say, energy drinks, we take it 2 times a day or 3 times a day sometimes. So these are the patients who can take these supplementary diets, peptide-based diets, 2 to 3 times a day. Second category is the patient who are recovering from critical illness from ICU. For the patient, suppose who has been on ventilator or chronic pancreatitis or acute pancreatitis, is improving, is taking orally. Again, his oral intake is not always optimal. For these patients, to suit their palate, they can have their normal diet, whatever is being prescribed by the dietitian. But to supplement to and achieve their target calories and proteins, again, they should have some supplementary diets with this peptide-based diets because the gut is tolerates them better. Regarding how long for the second category of patients, I would say as long as if their normal oral intake is adequate and they're tolerating it, you can, once they come to that stage, you can stop this peptide-based diets. It will not be continued. For acutely ill patients who have improved, you need not.
Okay, great. So, ma'am, another question by Ms. Swapna. What is the timing of feeding for the normally to be followed? So, why 2 hourly feed in a patient's on ventilator, for example, while a normal person doesn't keep on eating every 2 hours?
Right.
So, what should be the
Because
time of it?
yeah, time get 2 hourly has been devised is mainly for convenience actually. The two ways of you give nasogastric feed, either it is continuous or it is bolus method. Continuous, you hang a back and it is continuous. You set a rule, maybe 50 ml per hour or 60 ml per hour or 70 ml per hour. But most of the Indian ICUs I see, continuous method is not given due to sterilization or infection control issues. This bolus method is more often adopted. This 2 hour comes from convenience because once you have given a feed, that is over. If you have to give it every 1 hourly, you have to, you have to make the patient sit up position. You have to drag him up if he has slided down. For a patient on ventilator, again, you need assistance. So every 1 hourly becomes too more frequent for a patient who is on ventilator. So it becomes cumbersome for the nursing staff. 2 hour, you have some gap. You have given the feed, you have rested the patient. Patient wants to slide down and lie flat, he can. And by the time again another feed comes from the kitchen. Because one of the reasons you saw that delayed procurement of feed is also another reason for skipping feeds, right? So every 1 hourly, if you ask the kitchen boy to bring the feed from the kitchen, he'll not like, he'll quit job and go. So or you have a kitchen in the ICU. So it's 2 hours for convenience, I think. That's why.
Yes.
And you also allowed sufficient time for the gut to absorb and do its job, right?
Yes. So, ma'am, there is another question. So, in high risk critical care conditions, till what volume of GRV feed is continued with regular monitoring? This is by Mr. Rahul.
So that repeat that question. How much?
Yes. So, for high
Gastric.
risk critical patients, till what volume of GRV feed is continued with regular monitoring?
Okay, you gastroresidual volume you ask, right? I said that. See, if you're a patient who is on bolus method of GI of enteral feed, up to if the GRV, that is gastric residual volume, if it is less than 50%
Volume.
of the previous feed, you can give the next feed. You can push that. Suppose you have given 200 ml, you are getting 60 ml, right? So you can push that 60 ml and you can give your next feed. Again, check after 2 hours how it is. If it is more than 100, suppose you have given 200 ml, but it is now coming 120 ml, right? You need not give the next feed. Rather, you can just push that 120 ml, just push that 120 ml and leave it. Do not give the next feed. After 2 hours, you again check the GRD and accordingly you decide. But for a patient who, suppose this is for this kind of patients who has been on bolus fluid. For a patient who, suppose the patient in question I mentioned was got pancreatitis, the aspirate has reduced to say less than 500 ml. That is the point where you can contemplate to start enteral feed in these cases. If the GRV in these cases is less than 500 ml for a patient who are going to you are going to start it. Less than 500 ml is okay.
Okay. So, ma'am, there is one very interesting question by Ms. Mehta. How can the gap for the tests can be compensated? So those gaps which are there when we take the patient for the test or any kind of a procedure, how can we compensate those gaps, feeding gaps?
No, that is very. If first of all, the prerequisite is the nurse has or the doctor has to be very much caring about the nutrition. Suppose you have missed those diets, patient comes back, you said my calorie is missing. I will definitely give before my your shift finishes or the 24-hour is over, right? Suppose you have to give 1500 calorie for that day, and 600 has been given, and 900 calories left. So again, whatever time gap is available, you have to divide the number of calories divided by the number of feed that you are going to give and give accordingly. But we have to remember that number one, that at a time the feed should not exceed 200 to 250 ml, right? Because it will distend the stomach. Number two, if it becomes too much calorie concentrated and protein concentrated, again there'll be intolerance. Patient might have diarrhea or vomiting, and your GRV may be high. There is no pointing. It's similar to a situation like suppose the son has missed the lunch, and in the dinner time, mother says, "Oh, my son did not eat lunch. Let me feed him double lunch and the dinner twice." Allows, you have to, according to the calorie concentration, calorie and the protein concentration, you try to compensate for it.
Yes.
It's very difficult to compensate almost all the times though. But you have to make sure that next subsequent times it is not missed for those fatigue causes.
It's more kind of a volume based feeding approach rather than a rate based approach which should be adapted
Yes.
the feeding parts.
Right.
All right. So thank you so much, ma'am, for that wonderful discussion. And my sincere thanks to you and all the participants for this attending this session. I thank all the participants and speaker on behalf of Mr. Abdul Hanan, our cluster business head for the SAR region and entire Nestle Health Science team. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here and sparing your valuable time with us during these challenging times. So thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you, Dr. Pritesh, and all the attendees, for all those people who have stayed back till late evening now to have a discussion on the diet. So it really shows that how interested or serious you are about nutrition. So all of you stay safe, take care, and do eat well and take care of yourself. See you soon sometime.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.